welcome again to Chapter 5 of the Fix INEC Fix Nigeria Report Part 1. In this report, I'm going to be sharing with you, I'm going to be making a case for why reforming INEC is a necessity for national progress. In the Part 1 of this report of the Fix INEC Fix Nigeria series, we've been able to make a very strong case that Nigeria is underperforming, and the leadership is a major reason for that underperformance. We've also been able to make a case that this leadership or poor leadership has consequences, and that INEC is broken, and INEC has led to the emergence of the incompetent leaders that have led to the kind of development outcomes that we've experienced. Now we've made that case, we've also made a case for why reforming INEC is needed, and that is what we're going to be furthering on or buttressing in this chapter of the Fix INEC Fix Nigeria Report Part 1. So at the end of this report, I'm hopeful that I would have made a very strong case that reforming INEC is a necessity for our national progress. We're going to make the connection between INEC's underperformance and the different sectors of Nigeria's economy. So let's dive right into this chapter. So the reality is that electoral outcomes shape policy directions and the country's long-term trajectory. Elections matter because they set the tone for a nation's direction every 4 years, every decade, you name it. Because electoral outcomes are a reflection of the public will. Remember, in the previous chapter, where I talked about the concept of representative democracy, where citizens empower those in office with the power to make decisions on their behalf. They give them a mandate. And so, after an election, it is supposed that the outcome of that election is a reflection of the public will. But when that will is subverted, it now means that those in power also have a mandate to deliver on their own personal agendas. So if you have someone who emerges from the electoral process that is corrupt and was able to subvert the system, it's also seen as a reflection of the public will, and society will rally around that person. The organs of government will bend to that leader's will. So elections have consequences. People are given a clear mandate to govern, and depending on who and the leaders who are given the clear mandate to govern will deploy their manifesto for economic development and the rest of it. Also, elections have impact on policy directions because various people who run for office have their ideologies, their priorities, their governance styles, and they put all of these on the table during their campaign. And so if you have an election where citizens want a different agenda, but because the person who runs for office is able to subvert the public will and is elected, he will deploy his own agenda that is contrary to the public's will. So when you have leaders who manipulate the process, they would prioritize their own self-interest as opposed to the interest of the masses. So also, electoral outcomes also have a long-term effect on a nation's economic and social development. Because leaders who emerge from a free and fair election are more likely to enact policies that drive sustainable growth and development, because they know that their mandate was given to them by the people, not by their ability to manipulate the system. They would work to ensure education, healthcare, and structural reforms are enacted that strengthen the economy. So elections have long-term effect. And also, elections also affect the quality of governance and public trust. The reality is that the government gains legitimacy from the citizens. Because if you look at the population of those in government and those that are citizens, it's quite disproportionate. A fewer number of people are in government compared to citizens, but citizens entrust the government with power. And if those that emerge are a reflection of citizens' desire, the reality is that the quality of governance and the level of public trust on that government would increase across the different democratic institutions. Citizens will be able to collaborate with that government to implement the policies of that administration. But when elections are rigged, public trust erodes. Citizens do not engage. There will be civil unrest, protest, and significant resistance to the government's policies. Also, when electoral outcomes or when elections are done properly, it inspires hope and also increases citizens' commitment to nation building, because citizens believe that they are part of the process, and so they commit towards working and driving that government to ensure that they succeed. Also, when elections in a nation are conducted properly, it affects the national and regional standing or the global standing of that nation, because foreign direct investments are likely to come into that nation. Why? Because foreign investors believe that the government of that nation is stable. It is not working in variance of purpose with its citizens. It is a government that reflects the popular will and demands of citizens. And so there's a lot more likelihood that that government is going to receive the backing of the citizens. At the same time, there will be a lot of stability, because citizens have no reason to protest or commit acts that is at variance with desire or the actions of the success of that government. So it also gives that government legitimacy in engaging with other nations, regional partners, or regional counterparts, or regional countries. And in global standing, it gives them a strong sense of respect, because fellow leaders understand that that leader in office is acting on behalf of his citizens, because he has a mandate from his citizens. So electoral outcomes have significant impact on a nation's development. Now, we've made that case for why elections have consequences and why reforming INEC, a key body responsible for ensuring the kind of free and fair elections we need, is important. But now, let's look at the cross-sectoral impact of electoral integrity on development outcomes. Because we've been broad, right? We've been broad. You might be in banking, you might be in finance, you might be in healthcare, you might be in different industries, and you're wondering, how does INEC affect you? Or you might be a development partner, you might be an NGO worker, you might be a creative, you might be a shoemaker, you might be a market woman, and you're asking, how does INEC really affect me? In this chapter, I'm going to make a case for why INEC has an effect on your industry. So, I'll start with education. For education in Nigeria has pending reforms, and there's a role of electoral integrity in affecting that. Now let's take a look at what's happening in the education sector. There are several government initiatives like Universal Basic Education Commission. There's a school feeding program that's currently being enacted. There's also the teacher professional development programs designed to upskill teachers. There's also the tertiary education fund project that's currently being enacted by the government to support this space. Legislative reforms that have been passed and debated by the National Assembly aimed at improving the Universal Basic Education Act of 2004 that has made free and compulsory feeding for children up to junior education level. There's also international donor programs like the Global Partnership for Education, and there's also Education Cannot Wait program, UNICEF and UNESCO initiatives that are targeted at the education, improving the quality of outcomes in the education sector. There's also private and civil society efforts from organizations like MacArthur Foundation, ActionAid, that have funded initiatives in the past to strengthen accountability in education and ensure effective use of public funds. There's also tech-driven solutions such as e-learning platforms that are currently enabling digital literacy, and several startups are currently working in that space. But these are different things that are currently happening across different stakeholders, from government, private sector, and NGOs, trying to improve the quality of outcomes in the education space. Now, what is the connection between all these actions with electoral integrity? Now, the reality is that transparent and credible elections will produce leaders who understand that their tenure is dependent on fulfilling the campaign promises and meeting the needs of their constituents. Now, in the context of education, such leaders who emerge from a free and fair process, right, what would they do? They will allocate adequate funding for education. They would ensure that they are more likely to adhere to UNESCO's recommendation for allocating 20% of national budget to education, because citizens demand that education is placed at there's a significant emphasis that needs to be placed on education. They would also implement strategic policies that would drive leaders. They would formulate policies that would drive accountability in how these funds are dispersed. They would also address the root causes of education challenges rather than temporarily and adopting temporary and politically expedient solutions. They will be much open to collaborate with stakeholders and work closely with the private sector and civil society and international donors to ensure the effective implementation of education reforms, because they know that they are subject to the desires of Nigerians who put them into office. So, I'm going to share with you some case studies of what has happened when electoral integrity have affected the outcome of leaders that we have had in the last couple of years. So, what have we experienced? For example, the Amajiri project, education project, a project that was aimed to integrate Islamic education with formal schooling for over 10 million Almajiri children. Despite getting significant funding, and many schools were built under this program, but over time, as a result of governance lapses, unaccountable leaders who prioritize political gains over long-term planning and monitoring, several state governments have failed to maintain these projects, citing insufficient fund and political interest. So you can see the elections have consequences. So we have governors of governments who didn't take that project very seriously. There have been cases of universal basic education fund misappropriation across multiple states, because you have leaders who come into power with low integrity because of the process, and so they're more likely to have stooges in government who would misappropriate funds. Because when you have leaders, girl child education in the Northeast, international donors have poured in money, have spent serious resources to improve outcomes in that space. But there's poor coordination and lack of political will from the leaders, because they are more interested in consolidating power than addressing systemic issues. So electoral integrity matters. It's very important. We have teacher salary delays in Benue and Kogi State and several other states where teachers are not paid. Why? It's management of funds. Because there's a lack of commitment in some of these states by the state government, whose leaders have been accused of emerging from manipulated elections. So elections have consequences. It has affected teachers' salaries, because when you have governors who know they don't pay teachers' salaries, their mandate will not be renewed in the next election. They will prioritize the payment of teachers' salaries. We have the Gender and Equality and Opportunities Bill. So you can see, the education sector in Nigeria is sort of like a microcosm of the country's broader governance challenges, where systemic inefficiency and leadership failure has undermined decades of reforms and initiatives designed to improve. And you can find a role. You can also, from what I've been able to share with you, you can realize that the quality of our elections have an effect on the quality of leaders that emerge and the kind of emphasis they place on ensuring education outcomes that are positive for Nigerians and Nigerian masses. Let's look at poverty and inequality in Nigeria and some of the pending reforms and the role of electoral integrity in affecting this space. So, despite Nigeria being Africa's largest economy, we have over 70 to 80 million people that are currently living below poverty line. Now, the government has come up with several initiatives to address this, from the Gender Equalities and Opportunities Bill in 2015 that was launched in 2016, and the Empower Project, the Conditional Cash Transfer Project, the Government Enterprise and Empowerment Project, microloans targeted at small-scale traders and artisans. We also have the agricultural development programs like the Anchor Borrower Program that was aimed to support smaller farmers and improve food security. The private sector is also working, from organizations like the Tunu Elumelu Foundation and Dangote Foundation that has been focused on empowering small businesses and providing microfinance, investing in community development. You can see that there's quite a lot of work happening. On the legislative side, you have Social Welfare Trust Bill that was passed in 2015 that had livable wage policies. We have Gender Equalities and Opportunities Bill. So there are several things that are currently being done, right, to address this issue of poverty and inequality. So what is the impact of electoral integrity on poverty? It still applies. Leaders who are transparently elected are inherently accountable to their citizens. So this accountability will now drive the policies that they prioritize. They would focus on poverty reduction and reduction of inequality, because they know that 80 million to 70 million of the population live below the poverty line. And so they would understand that. And what would they do? They would enact fair budgetary allocations. They will be transparent leaders. They will ensure that the budgets that they create prioritize several sectors of the economy, like education, healthcare, and social protection, that directly have an impact on poverty and inequality. They would also be very, very conscious of crucially looking at policies they can continue. So it's not really about, oh, this government is out and I will just come up with my own policy. They would ask themselves, how do I ensure good governance outcome for the people that I'm governing? Because they gave me a mandate. And so they will scrutinize the policies of previous administration and say, okay, this policy is good, and how do I continue on those policies? They would also focus on vulnerable groups. And they would also be very, very critical about addressing the issue of waste and corruption that has bedeviled our budgets. A strong electoral process would ensure that you have leaders who are equitably deploying the resources of Nigerians' commonwealth. They will not engage in corruption, pattern of budgets, wasteful spending. They will be very intentional about ensuring strategic investments. So leaders who are elected with the people's mandate will focus on long-term investments in education, healthcare, and social infrastructure, because they want to address inequality. They will be very, very open to collaborating with stakeholders. They will be more interested in working with development partners and private sectors to implement impactful projects that have strong long-term impact. A good example of how INEC failure has led to ineffective sectoral outcomes, for example, is conditional cash transfer programs that has been mismanaged across multiple states. So we had a Nigeria's conditional cash transfer program that was designed to provide financial assistance to the poorest households. But in several states, implementation has been marred with delays, inefficiencies, and allegations of fund diversion, where you have these funds allocated and there are allegations that these funds didn't reach the people who really need it, but into the coffers of political parties, representatives, and things like that. These are all allegations. So governance failures at the state level, national level. You have leaders who are not committed to oversight because they don't care. This has impacted many beneficiaries. For example, you had Empower stalled payments, the PAP program designed in the past to provide thousands of participants with resources, and what do you have? They experience months of unpaid stipends because of poor coordination and political interference by state leaders. You have misallocation of COVID-19 relief funds. The allegations that some of these funds that were designed to provide hope to the poor masses were misallocated. Even some of the food products or the relief materials were branded as campaign materials. That is as a result of having leaders who know that they can subvert the public will in an election. You have abandoned poverty alleviation projects in the Northeast, Borno State, and several other projects. So as you can see, elections have consequences because you have leaders who understand that they don't have to answer to the masses, and so they will not be very, very circumspect in regards to how they deploy some of the initiatives and policies that they've even thought about that would affect the public good, allow occasions of corruption and mismanagement of funds to happen. So elections have consequences on the fight to eradicate poverty and address inequality. Unemployment and the economy, there's an effect of elections on that. Just like I talked about before, you had you had some reforms from National Assembly designed to address some of these issues, from the Universal Basic Education Act that was designed to ensure that education is free and fair. These are what they're currently doing. From the Startup Act in 2022, this is a law that was designed to ensure that startups that designed to regulate the startups industry, to the Petroleum Industry Act, to the labor market reforms. There are several reforms that have been put forward by the legislative arm of government to the executive arm and government programs designed to address unemployment, from the National Social Investment Programs to the Economic Sustainability Plan, to the Anchorage Borough Plan as well, to the Nigerian Industrial Revolution Plan, to youth empowerment programs, to job placement programs, you name them. Several initiatives have been embarked upon to address the issue of unemployment. To international donors who have come up with projects, from the World Bank for Nigerian Women Project to Africa Development Bank projects, to International Labour Organization projects. There are several projects that have been embarked on to address this issue of unemployment. But we are still struggling with addressing this issue. Elections have consequences. Because when you have leaders who emerge from transparent and credible elections, the kind of ministers, the kind of people they empower to address this issue of unemployment will not be politically motivated. They will be motivated with the desire to really address this problem fundamentally. They would implement policies that reduce employment and support medium-scale and medium enterprise development and desire to attract investments. They will be so focused on diversification, and they'll be thinking about how can they enact reforms that will transform agriculture, manufacturing, and technology and reduce our dependence on oil. They would ensure equitable access to opportunity for marginalized groups, particularly women and youths. Because when you emerge from flawed elections, the leaders who would prioritize self-enrichment. They will not care about these things. Who you help? They are mostly focused on settling the power brokers, the people who got them into office. And we don't care so much about the masses, because the masses didn't play a very critical role in getting them into power. All they have to just do is bribe the masses during elections, and they can do whatever they want. They won't even think about these issues at a more fundamental, deep level. So a good case study is a great case study about how INEC failure has led to ineffective sectoral outcome when it comes to poverty alleviation is the Ajaokuta steel plant. For example, up until now, despite the amount of investment that has been made on that plant is not yet functional. Despite the billions of naira investment that has been made, it's not yet functional. You have the NPower payment delays that I've talked about in the previous. We have the national housing scheme that was launched, and many of these projects have been stalled or abandoned as a result of the quality of leaders. You also have the neglect of the agricultural transformation agenda. There are several agricultural transformation agendas that have emerged, but as a result of the quality of our elections and the quality of leaders that we have, some of these projects have been marred by corruption. So you can see evidently that elections have consequences, because when leaders emerge from transparent elections, it affects the kind of focus, the kind of hands-on approach, the kind of rolling up their sleeve approach to ensure that they pay attention to some of these issues. Elections have consequences. Elections also builds investor confidence, because investors believe that since these elections are free and fair, they're a reflection of the public will. It means that whatever decisions that the government is making is a reflection of the people's will, and so that means there will be political stability, and so there's funds when they invest in that economy is safe. And leaders who come through a credible process are more focused on long-term economic impact, because they know that the next election is guaranteed if they deliver on the desires of their citizens. And so they'll be so focused on delivering for their citizens, because they know that when they go back to the ballot, they have a lot of things to showcase. And so they are more committed to delivering good governance outcomes. So elections have consequences. So how free and fair elections have consequences on the growth of our nation. So now we're going to look at trade and finance. So if you're in the banking space, you're in the finance space, you are in the money business, crypto, you name them. The role of electoral integrity in affecting your space. And how does that affect it? For example, in the legislative reforms, there are currently reforms around the Finance Act that's currently been passed in 2023. You have the Credit Reporting Act in 2017 that was passed. You have the Secure Transactions and Movable Asset Act that was passed in 2014. You have the government programs like the Anchor Borrower Program that was passed. You have the Micro, Small and Medium Enterprise Development Fund that was created and managed by the CBN. You have the National Collateral Registry. You have the EFCFT implementation strategy that was endorsed. Private society are currently working to improve that space, from fintech and mobile banking solutions to non-profit advocacy by SMEs, to ensure that SMEDAN and several organizations and entrepreneurs have access to financial literacy, capacity building, and policy advocacy. The international donors like the World Bank that is currently working to ensure rural access to agricultural marketing under the Rural Access and Agricultural Marketing Project. We also have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Financial Inclusion Project. We have the African Development Bank Trade Finance Programs, all focused on ensuring that there is access to finance, we're able to improve economic outcomes and ensure that the financial industry or financial space is thriving. Now, what is the role of electoral integrity in affecting this space? The first significant role of a transparent electoral process is that it ensures policy stability. Because when you have leaders with a legitimate mandate, they are more likely to implement consistent trade and financial policies that reduce uncertainty for businesses. They are more likely to ensure resources are equitably accountable. They ensure that financial inclusion programs target marginalized groups and reduce regional disparities because they know that these people at the grassroots are the people that will vote for them. So they'll be more intentional in ensuring that whatever projects that they enact are not derailed by some of the criminal components of the middle class or political stooges and the rest of them, because they know that the power belongs to the people. So they'll be very intentional about that. They would also be trusted in institutions. It will strengthen public confidence on government initiatives. When government sneeze, people will back them. People will rally around them because they know that the person in government is a reflection of the public will. Electoral integrity gives government institutions integrity. Without electoral integrity, there will be governance failures and also undermine trade and financial inclusion efforts. Electoral integrity also improves. We have leaders who would be accountable to the electorate. They will support small-scale businesses because they amount or contribute to 48% of our GDP, because they employ over 80% of our workforce. It will also improve investor confidence. Investors will be very, very confident because they know that, wait a minute, if we don't, this election is a reflection of the public will. Now let's look at the impact of how INEC failure has led to ineffective sectoral outcome for the finance industry. For example, there has been a gradual neglect of the ASC FTA implementation strategy, because while we have signed onto that agreement, there have been leadership failures that have been tied to an unaccountable government that have resulted in the absence of a clear roadmap for how MSCs can really leverage that opportunity. Many Nigerians have struggled to understand how they can completely and effectively tap into African markets. CBN cashless policy rollout. For example, we are aware in 2023 where the CBN cashless policy came out of nowhere and it just came and disrupted the economy, right? Yes, the policy was good. It was designed to aim at boosting digital transactions, but due to poor implementation that was, in quotes, politically motivated, and lack of inadequate political infrastructure between federal and state government, because of these leaders, some of these leaders are merged from the electoral process. So they didn't really critically think about the masses and how they would feel when they implemented some of these policies and how they rolled out the policy. It led to serious financial exclusion at that process. There's also the abandoned trade facilitation projects. There are several projects that have been abandoned as a result of failure to be very intentional about enacting reforms, and this is a result of failed elections. So elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. It has had an effect on the finance space, from corrupt proceeds that flow in and out of banks, from banks that have struggled, that have had to fail as a result of poor oversight. So elections have consequences. The quality of our elections have consequences. INEC being the arbiter or the regulator of elections, and their failure have consequences on you, a banker, on you, a fintech bro, on you, a crypto, wherever you are in the finance space. Elections have consequences. Now I'm going to take a look at the agriculture and food security space. So now, if you're a farmer, you're in the agricultural space, you are focused on breeding livestock. Basically, you're thinking about how we solve the problem of food security. The reality is that INEC has a role to play in affecting the outcomes that you experience in that space. And I'm going to share with you how INEC's role in ensuring food security for you, or ensuring that those in the agricultural space are able to thrive, and how it has affected it. The reality is that agriculture has historically been a backbone of Nigeria's economy. It has employed at least over 70% of the population. Our grandparents, brothers and sisters in the village, uncles and aunties, most of them are in the village, particularly in rural areas, practicing subsistence farming and the rest. The reality is that despite all of this, food insecurity remains a serious issue in Nigeria, with millions of Nigerians lacking access to affordable, nutritious food. So let's take a look at some of the things that have happened in the past by different stakeholders to address this issue of food security. So let's look at the legislative reforms that have been enacted in the past. We have the National Agricultural Development Fund Act that was passed, the Land Use Act that was reviewed. We have the government programs like the Anchor Borrowers Scheme for farmers, for smallholder farmers. We have the Green Imperative program that was in partnership with Brazil to drive mechanized services for farmers. We have the National Agriculture Technology and Innovation Policy Project that was also deployed, that was launched in 2021, right? You also have the Strategic Grain Reserves Program. The private sector efforts and civil society has also worked towards ensuring that this space experiences some form of development. We're able to achieve results. You have the agri-tech startups that have like Tribe Agri, Farm Crowdy, that came up to connect farmers with investors, inputs, and markets using digital platforms. We have NGOs who have organized. We have NGOs like Action Aid, Oxfam that have advocated for improved access to resources for women and smallholder farmers. You have also private investment by Nigerians, large businesses, cooperatives that have invested in processing plants and export-oriented farming to boost the value chain. We also have international donors that have come into this space, like the World Bank Agricultural Transformation Agenda Support Program. You have the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, that have been providing technical support to address food insecurity and to improve the resilience of the climate shocks. You have the African Development Bank that have been funding projects to improve rice production and reduce Nigerians' dependence on food imports. So you have so many organizations, so many efforts by both government, legislative reforms, private sector, you name them, to ensure that Nigeria is food secure. But we've not been able to achieve the kind of food security that we want to achieve. Why? Let's look at the role of electoral integrity in achieving this. The reality is that food security policies requires leaders who prioritize local rural development and equitable resource distribution. Transparent leaders would ensure that the subsidies, the grants, and the loans reach the smallholder family who need them the most. They are more likely to pay attention to corruption. They know how to placate or make sure that the process sort of like favors their party members, all those kind of things. No. They will make sure that these resources gets to every Nigerian on the grassroots, because they know that if they don't get it, they will not vote for them in the next election. They're more likely to focus on long-term planning. Think about sustainable agricultural policies that would address climate change, mechanization, and rural infrastructure development. Really think about that critically. They're more likely to support agricultural innovation because they would invest in research and development. They will promote modern farming techniques and technologies. But when elections are compromised, you have leaders who place in top priority political patronage over agricultural reforms. Their brother, their sister, their stooges in different states. So they see all these agendas, all these projects as an opportunity to reward loyal followers, those kind of things. That's what happens. And so the project and the resources squandered. Good ideas, powerful innovations, powerful efforts, because you have the leaders who do not have that strong incentive, who know that at the end of the day, elections are important. They will now, what you end up having is there will be politicization of these efforts to now leave farmers and rural communities underserved. So it has consequences on our food security. A good example is our abandoned fertilizer subsidy programs that has now been abandoned. A good example is the failure of the Lake Chad Basin agricultural project. It has consequences. The inefficiencies of the Anchor Borrower program that have been plagued by fraud and corruption, weak oversight, unaccountability. Elections have consequences. It has an impact on the quality of leaders and their focus on addressing these things. When you have leaders who emerge from a credible process, they are more likely to be so focused on empowering farmers, because farmers make a very significant voting bloc in Nigeria. They are more likely to be focused on reducing rural poverty, thinking about infrastructure like roads, irrigation systems, and storage facilities. They are more likely to look at the policies from the previous administrations that are really good, and they will now continue with those policies instead of just doing away with it, because they know at the end of the day that what matters most is not who bears the name of a project or who started a project, but the kind of development that the people that they govern are experiencing. So you can see that electoral integrity has a significant impact on the lived reality of those in the agricultural space. Now, we're going to look at housing and infrastructure and the role of elections in affecting housing and infrastructure. So, if you are a contractor in the real estate space, or you're a citizen who needs a place to stay, you're complaining of rising rents, you're complaining of poor quality construction, dilapidated buildings that fall here and there, buildings that have low or poor structural integrity, you name them. The reality at the moment is that we have a housing deficit with over 22 million housing units that are needed to meet demand. And even the ones that we already have, we have a lot of low quality housing everywhere, even in our tier 1 cities like Abuja and Lagos, and also Port Harcourt, tier 2 cities, Port Harcourt and Kaduna. We still have houses that are low quality. So even the houses that we currently have are poor in terms of quality, and then we have a deficit of about 22 million. The reality is that several stakeholders in the past and the present have been working to address these issues. So look at the summary of what has been happening in this space. So for example, there have been legislative reforms like the National Housing Fund that was established in 2018 to address this issue. Also, the Land Use Act was also established. We also have the Infrastructure Concessionary Regulatory Commission Act that was established in 2015 by the legislative arm of government. We also have the Anchor Borrower Program too as well. We also have the National Housing Program by the government as an initiative that was created. We also have the Road Infrastructure Development Project that was created. We also have the Rural Electrification Project that was created, the National Housing Scheme, Sustainability Plan Project, several projects, civil society projects, private sector and civil society efforts have also emerged from private real estate developers that have been trying to build houses, NGO housing initiatives like the Habitat for Humanity work, and civil society groups that are pushing for land allocation processes and equitable housing programs. We also have the private sector and civil society efforts like the World Bank Nigeria Affordable Housing Project, the African Development Bank Urban and Municipal Development Support Project. Several initiatives have been put out to support and transform this space. But guess what? Elections have consequences. How does an election have consequences? INEC's electoral integrity have an impact in the kind of outcomes we're experiencing in this space. How? Because infrastructure development requires stable leadership and long-term investment, policy continuity, and all of this depends on credible elections and accountable governance. Leaders who emerge from transparent elections are more likely to ensure policy continuity, are more likely to promote accountability, transparent allocation of funds towards housing projects that benefit the public rather than serving their political or personal interest. They are more likely to attract investments in that space that would enable public-private partnerships that would support large-scale infrastructure projects. In contrast, flawed elections also lead to leadership that would prioritize deploying all these resources for their personal gain. Abandoned projects everywhere. Money deployed to build houses. What you already end up realizing, contractor will take the money, eat the money, and not deliver on those projects because of leadership, the quality of leadership that has emerged. Electoral outcomes have impact on the level of infrastructure investments that come into a nation, because leaders that come from a popular mandate, from a system that is free and fair, are able to encourage investors to want to come and invest. Accountable leadership will be very focused on ensuring affordable housing for low-income groups rather than luxury development projects that cater to the elites. They will also be very focused on how to minimize corruption in governance, right? Reduce the risk of funds being misallocated. Look at how, now let's take a look at how INEC failures has led to sectoral outcomes. For example, we have the abandoned Ajaokuta Kaduna Kano gas pipeline project that have had an effect on industrializing the northern part of Nigeria. We also have the mismanagement of the CBN cashless policy. We also have mismanagement of road construction projects that would have opened up some areas and ensured more development would have occurred in that space. In some areas, we also have slums that have not been upgraded because of donor-funded projects that have experienced lack of government presence. So you can see that to a large degree, elections have consequences on the quality of outcomes in the infrastructure, house and infrastructure space.